Sometimes the richest hearts wear the cheapest coats, and sometimes the poorest hands give away the most. The rain fell steadily over downtown Boston, turning the sidewalks into shimmering ribbons of gray beneath the glowing streetlights. People hurried past with umbrellas tucked close, eyes fixed on their phones, too busy to notice anyone standing still. Grace Bennett stood outside a neighborhood bakery, pulling the collar of her faded blue jacket tighter around her neck as she counted the money in her hand for what felt like the 10th time that evening. One wrinkled $1 bill. That was everything she had left until payday, still 3 days away. She smiled anyway, slipping the bill carefully into her pocket before glancing at the paper bag she carried. Inside sat a single turkey sandwich she had bought for her dinner after finishing another double shift at the cafe. It wasn't much, but it was enough. At least, that was what she kept telling herself. Across the street, a man sat quietly on a rain-soaked bench beneath a broken bus shelter. His dark jacket looked worn from years of use. His jeans were faded, and rainwater dripped from his hair onto his shoulders. He wasn't asking for money. He wasn't holding a cardboard sign. He simply stared at the buses passing by, as though waiting for one that never came. His name was Ethan Carter, although no one walking past would have believed that the quiet stranger owned one of the largest technology companies in America. Less than 12 hours earlier, he had stood inside a glass conference room overlooking the Boston skyline, while executives argued over market shares and billion-dollar acquisitions. But none of those conversations had answered the question that had haunted him for years. Did anyone still choose kindness when there was nothing to gain? Every relationship he had built since becoming wealthy seemed to carry invisible price tags. Every smile felt calculated. Every compliment sounded rehearsed. Even his closest advisors insisted that genuine people no longer existed around someone with his fortune. So Ethan had quietly disappeared from his world once again, leaving behind tailored suits, luxury, cars, and security details to become someone no one would ever notice. Tonight was supposed to be another observation. Nothing more. Then Grace crossed the street. She slowed as she noticed him rubbing his hands together against the cold. Their eyes met for only a second before she looked away, continuing toward the bus stop. She reached into her pocket, touching the last dollar she owned. Her stomach reminded her she hadn't eaten since breakfast. The sandwich suddenly felt even more valuable. She stopped walking. For a brief moment, practicality argued with compassion. 3 more days. Rent due next week. Her mother's prescription waiting at the pharmacy. Every reason in the world told her to keep moving. Instead, she turned around. "Excuse me," she said softly, stepping closer with a warm smile that reached her tired blue eyes. Ethan looked up, surprised. "Are you waiting for the number 9 bus?" she asked. He hesitated before answering. "I honestly don't know anymore." There was something genuine in his voice that caught her attention. Not desperation, not manipulation, just exhaustion. Grace opened her paper bag and carefully held out the sandwich. "I was going to eat this," she admitted with a quiet laugh, "but I think you probably need it more than I do." Ethan blinked, caught completely off guard. During countless undercover outings, people had ignored him, avoided eye contact, or offered polite apologies before walking away. No one had ever offered their own dinner. "I can't take your food," he replied. Grace shrugged gently. "You can. Tomorrow will figure itself out." Before he could respond, she reached into her pocket and unfolded the wrinkled $1 bill. She looked at it for only a second before placing it carefully beside the sandwich. "Maybe this helps with coffee in the morning," she said. Ethan stared at the tiny bill resting in his palm as though it weighed 100 pounds. He knew the look of worn currency. That wasn't spare change someone barely noticed losing. It had been folded and unfolded too many times. Protected. Saved. It was the last dollar she owned. "Why would you do this for a stranger?" he asked quietly. Grace smiled, pulling her jacket tighter against the cold. "Because someday I might be the stranger who needs someone else to stop walking." She gave him one final smile before stepping onto the arriving bus. Ethan remained frozen on the bench, watching the taillights disappear into the rain while the untouched sandwich rested beside the worn dollar in his trembling hands. For the first time in years, the billionaire who believed every human heart could be measured realized he had just met someone who couldn't be bought at all. The next morning, sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Carter Dynamics headquarters, casting golden reflections across polished marble floors and walls lined with awards that celebrated innovation, leadership, and extraordinary success. Employees moved quickly through the lobby, greeting one another with confident smiles as elevators carried executives toward another day of multi-million-dollar decisions. Yet inside the top-floor boardroom, Ethan Carter was not looking at financial reports or market forecasts. The only thing resting in front of him was a carefully folded $1 bill beside a slightly wrinkled paper bag that still carried the faint scent of turkey and fresh bread. Around the conference table, several executives exchanged puzzled glances. "Is there a reason today's meeting has not started?" one director finally asked. Ethan remained silent for a long moment before carefully placing the dollar back inside his wallet. "Reschedule everything afternoon," he said calmly. "I have something more important to do." His assistant, Olivia Reynolds, followed him into his office a few minutes later carrying a tablet full of appointments. "The investors from Seattle are already on their way," she reminded him. Ethan walked toward the enormous window overlooking Boston Harbor. "Find the woman from last night." Olivia blinked. "Excuse me." "The woman who gave away her dinner. Do you know her name?" Ethan slowly smiled. "Not yet." By lunchtime, Olivia returned carrying a slim folder. "Grace Bennett, 27 years old. Works at Harbor Street Cafe 6 days a week. Lives in a small apartment in South Boston with her mother, who has ongoing medical treatments. No criminal record. No outstanding debt besides student loans. Volunteers twice a month at a neighborhood food pantry." Ethan listened quietly without interrupting. "Anything unusual?" he asked. Olivia hesitated. "Actually, yes." She opened another page. Last year, she found an envelope containing almost $4,000 in cash outside a grocery store. Security cameras showed she turned it in immediately. The owner was eventually located. Ethan nodded slowly, almost as though the answer did not surprise him. "Thank you. Would you like me to arrange a meeting?" Olivia asked. "No." Ethan looked toward the old jacket hanging on the coat rack beside his office door. "She cannot know who I am." That evening, Harbor Street Cafe buzzed with its usual dinner crowd. The smell of grilled burgers, fresh coffee, and homemade pie filled the warm room, while country music drifted softly from hidden speakers. Grace moved quickly between tables with effortless kindness, remembering regular customers by name, and somehow making every guest feel welcome despite how busy the restaurant had become. "You look happier today," her coworker Lily whispered while refilling coffee cups. Grace smiled without thinking. "Do I?" "You are smiling for no reason." Grace laughed softly. "Maybe because yesterday reminded me that there are still people who need each other." Before Lily could answer, the front door opened. Ethan stepped inside wearing the same worn jacket and faded jeans from the night before. He paused as though uncertain whether he should stay. Grace noticed him almost immediately. "You made it," she called with genuine warmth. Ethan looked surprised. "You remember me?" She laughed. "You think I forget people that easily?" She guided him toward a small booth near the window. "Sit down. Coffee is fresh." Ethan glanced at the menu. "I cannot afford much." Grace leaned closer with a playful smile. "Good Things Soup is today's special." A few minutes later, she placed a steaming bowl of chicken noodle soup in front of him along with warm bread. "This should help." Ethan looked at the meal, then at her. "I only ordered coffee." Grace shrugged. The kitchen made an extra bowl. Across the room, the cook caught her eye with a confused expression, making it obvious no extra bowl had existed at all. Ethan understood immediately. She had quietly paid for his meal herself. He lowered his eyes, hiding an unexpected smile. Throughout dinner, he watched how she treated every customer exactly the same. An elderly veteran who counted coins one by one received the same patient respect as a businessman wearing an expensive watch. A young mother struggling to calm her restless toddler received encouragement instead of judgment. Even when a customer accidentally spilled iced tea across the table, Grace simply laughed, grabbed a towel, and assured him that accidents happened every day. There was never frustration in her voice, only steady kindness that seemed completely natural. As Ethan left the cafe that night, he reached for the $1 bill still tucked safely inside his wallet. It had become something far more valuable than money. It was proof that somewhere in a city rushing toward success, one ordinary woman still believed that compassion was worth more than convenience. And without realizing it, Grace Bennett had already begun changing a billionaire's heart long before she ever learned his name. Over the next several weeks, a quiet routine settled into both of their lives without either of them planning it. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, just before 7 o'clock, Ethan walked through the front door of Harbor Street Cafe, wearing the same worn jacket, carrying the same weathered backpack, and choosing the same booth beside the rain-speckled window. Grace never asked why he always arrived at the exact same time, and Ethan never explained that his entire executive calendar had quietly been rearranged around those dinners. To the board of Carter Dynamics, their billionaire founder had become strangely unavailable 2 evenings each week. To Grace, he was simply a kind man named Ethan who seemed grateful for warm soup and honest conversation. "You finally smiled before I even brought the coffee," Grace teased one evening as she placed his favorite mug on the table. Ethan looked up with an amused expression. "Maybe I was expecting good company." Grace laughed, shaking her head. "That is a pretty smooth answer for someone who claims he has been unlucky lately." Ethan smiled, but said nothing. Every conversation with her felt strangely effortless. She never tried to impress him. She never exaggerated her stories. She simply talked about ordinary life as though it contained extraordinary beauty. She described watching the sunrise while waiting for the first bus, laughing with elderly customers who came to the cafe every morning, and how her mother still insisted on baking blueberry pie whenever she felt strong enough to stand in the kitchen. Ethan found himself looking forward to those simple stories far more than billion-dollar presentations or glamorous charity galas. One rainy evening, Grace walked outside during her break and found Ethan sitting beneath the cafe awning watching the rain collect in puddles across the empty parking lot. She handed him half of a grilled cheese sandwich wrapped in a napkin. "You forgot dinner tonight," she said. Ethan looked at the sandwich before meeting her eyes. "How do you know?" She shrugged. "Because every time you skip eating, you spend more time staring at other people enjoying theirs." Ethan accepted the sandwich with a grateful smile. "You notice everything." "It comes with the job," she replied. They sat quietly listening to the rain. After a few peaceful minutes, Grace glanced toward him. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan nodded. "Of course. What did you used to do before things became difficult?" Ethan hesitated just long enough to choose his words carefully. "I built companies." Grace raised an eyebrow with playful curiosity. "Companies? Small ones," he answered with a gentle smile. "Some worked. Some did not." She laughed softly. "Well, that is still more impressive than burning grilled cheese the way I did when I was 16. Ethan found himself laughing harder than he had in months. It felt honest, natural, free from expectation. The following week, Grace finished her shift later than usual. As she locked the cafe door, she found Ethan waiting outside beneath a streetlight with 2 cups of hot chocolate from a nearby food truck. "I thought you might be tired of making coffee for everyone else," he said. Grace accepted the cup with a surprised smile. "Thank you." They walked slowly through the quiet neighborhood, passing rows of brownstone buildings decorated with flower boxes and softly glowing porch lights. At one point, they stopped beside a small community garden where tomatoes, herbs, and late summer flowers still flourished despite the cooling evenings. Grace gently brushed her fingertips across a lavender plant. "When I was little," she said, "my father always told me that you can learn everything about a person by watching how they treat things that cannot give them anything back." Ethan looked at her thoughtfully. "Do you believe that?" She smiled without looking up. "Every single day." Her words settled deep inside him. They echoed through his thoughts long after he drove back to the hidden garage where his luxury sedan waited behind tinted glass. That night, alone inside his penthouse overlooking the city lights, Ethan placed the folded $1 bill beside the expensive watch he had worn for years but no longer bothered to put on. One object represented unimaginable wealth. The other represented immeasurable character. For the first time since beginning his undercover journeys, he realized something had changed. He was no longer studying Grace Bennett to discover whether kindness still existed. He was beginning to hope she might one day see something worth loving in the man behind the disguise. And that hope frightened him far more than any business risk he had ever faced. Autumn arrived quietly, painting the trees around Boston with shades of gold and crimson, while Ethan found himself measuring time not by board meetings or quarterly reports, but by the evenings he spent talking with Grace. Somewhere along the way, the careful experiment he had designed had stopped feeling like an experiment at all. Every conversation lingered in his mind long after it ended, and every smile she offered seemed to follow him back into the polished silence of his penthouse. Yet the more his feelings grew, the more dangerous his secret became. One Friday morning, Olivia Reynolds entered Ethan's office carrying a folder he had requested weeks earlier. She placed it gently on his desk without saying a word. Ethan opened it slowly, expecting another routine background report, but every page revealed something that left him more humbled than the last. Grace Bennett had volunteered at the neighborhood food pantry for nearly 5 years, often staying after closing to organize donated groceries. She had quietly covered utility bills for an elderly neighbor during a harsh winter without telling anyone. 2 summers earlier, she had postponed replacing her own aging car so her mother could receive a medical treatment that insurance would not fully cover. There were no newspaper articles celebrating these moments, no social media posts collecting admiration, and no expectation that anyone would ever discover what she had done. Olivia finally broke the silence. Most people become generous after they become comfortable. She somehow managed to do the opposite. Ethan closed the folder with careful hands. "She never wanted credit," he said softly. Olivia nodded. "That seems to be who she is." Later that afternoon, Ethan attended a strategy meeting with the executive leadership team. Billion-dollar projections filled the enormous presentation screens while analysts discussed expansion into new markets. Normally, he would have challenged every assumption and questioned every detail, but today his thoughts wandered somewhere entirely different. He remembered Grace giving away her last dollar without hesitation. He remembered her sharing food she could barely afford. He remembered her saying that tomorrow would figure itself out. The numbers surrounding him suddenly felt strangely small compared to the quiet strength of one ordinary woman. After the meeting, one of the directors caught up with him in the hallway. "You have seemed distracted lately," the man observed. Ethan offered a polite smile. "Perhaps I have finally realized there are investments that cannot be measured on financial statements." That evening, Ethan arrived at Harbor Street Cafe a little earlier than usual. Grace was arranging fresh flowers in small glass jars on each table before the dinner crowd arrived. She looked up and smiled the moment she saw him. "You are early today. I thought I could help," Ethan replied. Grace laughed. "Unless you secretly know how to fold napkins into perfect triangles, I think I have everything under control." Without another word, Ethan picked up a stack of napkins and carefully copied the example she had left on the counter. His first attempt leaned sideways. The second looked even worse. Grace laughed so hard she had to wipe a tear from the corner of her eye. "Those are probably the saddest napkins Boston has ever seen." Ethan laughed with her. "I never claimed to have hidden talents." "Good," she answered. "Perfection is exhausting anyway." They finished setting the tables together, talking about everything from favorite childhood movies to the changing colors of the trees outside. At one point, Grace glanced through the cafe window toward a sleek black luxury sedan that had stopped briefly at the traffic light before disappearing down the street. "Can you imagine living that kind of life?" she asked casually. Ethan followed her gaze, but kept his expression calm. "Do you mean having that much money?" She nodded. "People always think wealth solves every problem. Do you disagree?" Grace smiled thoughtfully while adjusting a small vase of autumn flowers. "I think money can make life easier, and there is nothing wrong with that. But it cannot decide whether someone is honest. It cannot teach kindness. It cannot make a lonely person feel loved when everyone around them wants something." Ethan felt those words settle heavily inside him because they described his own life with painful accuracy. Before he could respond, Grace looked back at him with the same gentle smile she always carried. "I hope whoever owns that car has at least one person who cares about them even if they lose it tomorrow." Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment, suddenly unable to answer. Standing only a few feet away was the one person who already cared about him without knowing anything he owned. And every passing day made him wonder how much longer that beautiful truth could survive the secret he was still keeping. Inevitably, living 2 lives demanded choices that became harder to hide. On Monday mornings, Ethan stood before shareholders in a tailored navy suit, discussing innovation, long-term strategy, and record-breaking earnings while photographers captured every confident smile. By Tuesday evening, he was back inside Harbor Street Cafe wearing faded jeans, a worn jacket, and boots that looked as though they had survived years of hard work. The contrast had once amused him. Now it exhausted him. Every compliment Grace offered to the man she believed he was filled him with gratitude and guilt at the same time. One afternoon, the executive board gathered for a private strategy session inside the top-floor conference room. Charts covered the massive display screens, but the conversation drifted away from business when one director leaned back in his chair and studied Ethan carefully. "You have changed," he said. Another executive nodded. "You leave early. You ignore social events. Investors are asking questions." Ethan remained calm. Everything that matters is still getting done. A faint smile appeared on the face of another board member. "Is there someone?" The room grew unusually quiet. Ethan did not answer immediately. Finally, he looked around the table. "There is someone I respect more every day." Several executives exchanged knowing glances before Charles Whitmore, the oldest member of the board, folded his hands together. "Be careful," he warned. "People become different when they discover who you really are. I have watched it happen for 30 years. Ethan met his eyes. "What if someone does not?" Charles gave a slow, skeptical smile. "Everyone does." Those words followed Ethan all day. By evening, he found himself standing outside Harbor Street Cafe longer than usual before opening the door. Grace noticed him immediately. "Everything all right?" she asked as she poured him a cup of coffee. Ethan forced a small smile. "Just a long day." She studied his face for a moment before sitting across from him during a quiet break between customers. "You know," she said gently, "sometimes people carry heavy things because they think they have to carry them alone." Ethan looked into his coffee. And what if telling the truth changes everything? Grace rested her elbows lightly on the table. The truth usually changes everything. That does not always make it worse. Before Ethan could respond, Lily hurried over. "Grace, table 7 needs help." Grace stood but paused beside Ethan. "Do not disappear tonight. I still owe you dessert." Ethan smiled. "I will wait." An hour later, the dinner rush slowed, and Grace returned carrying 2 slices of homemade apple pie. "The baker made too many," she said with an innocent grin that Ethan recognized immediately. He laughed. "Did the baker also accidentally make 2 fresh scoops of vanilla ice cream?" Grace looked toward the kitchen. "Perhaps." They shared the pie while talking about childhood memories, favorite autumn traditions, and the first snowfall each hoped would arrive before Thanksgiving. For a little while, Ethan almost forgot he was pretending to be someone else. Then his phone vibrated inside his pocket. Only 3 people possessed that private number. He excused himself and stepped outside before answering. "What happened?" he asked quietly. Olivia's voice came through immediately. "There is nothing urgent. I only wanted to warn you. The business magazine scheduled tomorrow's cover story. Every major news outlet will be running your interview by morning." Ethan closed his eyes. "Can it be delayed?" "No. The printing has already started." After ending the call, he stood alone beneath the cool evening sky, realizing that his carefully separated worlds had begun moving toward each other faster than he could stop them. When he returned inside, Grace smiled warmly and handed him a small paper bag. "I packed you a turkey sandwich for tomorrow," she said. "You looked like someone who might forget lunch again." Ethan accepted the bag with quiet gratitude. "You really think about everyone except yourself, do not you?" Grace shrugged with a gentle smile. Return. The simple gesture felt more valuable than every luxury gift he had ever received. As he walked home later that evening, the lights of the city reflected across the Charles River, while tomorrow's headlines waited to introduce the real Ethan Carter to millions of readers. Yet the only opinion that truly mattered belonged to the woman who still believed he was nothing more than an ordinary man searching for his place in the world. And for the first time since this journey had begun, Ethan wondered whether the greatest risk was no longer losing the experiment, but losing the trust of the one person whose heart had never asked for anything except honesty. The following morning, Boston woke beneath a pale gray sky, while newspapers and business websites across the country featured the same smiling face on their front pages. Ethan Carter stood confidently in a tailored suit beside the headlines celebrating another historic year for Carter Dynamics, calling him one of the most influential entrepreneurs in America. Inside his office, however, the article remained folded on the corner of his desk, unread. Olivia Reynolds quietly stepped inside, carrying a cup of black coffee. "Every major network has already picked up the interview," she said. Ethan nodded without looking up. "Has anyone connected me to Harbor Street Cafe?" "Not that we can tell." She hesitated before adding, "But that may not last forever." Ethan leaned back in his chair, and looked toward the city beyond the glass walls. I never meant for this to last so long. Olivia offered a gentle smile. No, you meant to study someone for a few days. Instead, you fell in love. Ethan did not deny it. For several long seconds, silence filled the room. Finally, he spoke. The problem is not whether she will forgive the lie. The problem is whether I deserve forgiveness at all. That evening, Ethan arrived at the cafe carrying an unusually thoughtful expression. Grace noticed it immediately as she welcomed him to his usual booth beside the window. You have that look again, she said with a warm smile. Which look? The one that says your mind is somewhere else. Ethan laughed quietly. You always know. Grace placed a fresh cup of coffee in front of him before taking the seat across the table during a quiet moment between customers. Then tell me what is bothering you. Ethan looked down at the steam rising from the mug. He wanted to tell her everything. He wanted to admit that he owned the company whose logo decorated half the buildings downtown, that the watch hidden inside his apartment was worth more than the cafe earned in weeks, and that every conversation they had shared had begun with a secret. Instead, he asked a different question. If someone you trusted had hidden an important part of their life from you, would you ever forgive them? Grace considered the question carefully instead of answering immediately. That depends. On what? Why they hid it? Ethan looked up. Suppose they were afraid. Grace smiled gently. Fear explains a choice. It does not erase it. He remained silent. She continued. People make mistakes. I do not expect perfection from anyone. But trust grows from honesty, and honesty usually asks us to be brave before we feel ready. Her words settled deep inside him. They were not spoken with judgment. They were spoken with kindness, which somehow made them even more powerful. Before either of them could continue, Lily hurried over carrying her phone. Grace, look at this. Everyone has been talking about this billionaire all day. Lily turned the screen toward her. Ethan instinctively lowered his eyes before the photograph became visible. Grace glanced at the article for only a moment before smiling politely. He looks successful. Lily laughed. Successful? He is worth billions. Grace handed the phone back without another glance. I hope he remembers to call his mother once in a while. Lily shook her head with an amused grin and walked away. Ethan looked at Grace in disbelief. You are not curious? Grace shrugged. About what? His life. She smiled. I already have enough people in my own life to care about. Reading about strangers does not make my coffee taste any better. Ethan could not help laughing. Once again, she had chosen the ordinary over the extraordinary without realizing that the extraordinary was sitting across from her. As closing time approached, Grace reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small knitted keychain shaped like a tiny blue heart. I almost forgot, she said. My mother made this during one of her better afternoons. She said you always look like someone who carries too much on his shoulders. Ethan accepted the handmade gift with visible emotion. The yarn was simple. The stitches were imperfect. It was worth almost nothing in dollars and impossible to measure in meaning. Please thank her for me, he said softly. Grace smiled. She already likes you, even though she has never met you. Ethan slipped the little blue heart into his pocket beside the folded $1 bill, realizing that the two smallest things he carried had become the most valuable possessions he owned. As he walked away from the cafe beneath the glowing streetlights, he understood that the final decision could no longer be delayed. Every day he waited made the truth heavier. Every smile Grace offered made the coming confession more painful. He had begun this journey believing he was searching for proof that kindness still existed in the world. Instead, he had found a woman whose honesty demanded honesty in return. And for the first time in his life, the billionaire who could solve almost any problem with money discovered that there was only one thing capable of protecting the future he desperately wanted: the courage to tell the truth before someone else did it for him. The decision Ethan had postponed for weeks was finally made for him on a crisp Saturday morning. Carter Dynamics was hosting its annual Community Innovation Fair, an event that awarded grants to local charities, schools, and neighborhood organizations. Attendance from the company's founder was mandatory, and every major television station in Boston planned to cover the event live. Ethan had intended to tell Grace the truth before that day arrived, but every opportunity had slipped away beneath the weight of his own hesitation. By early afternoon, Harbor Street Cafe had become unusually busy. Customers gathered around their phones, discussing the event downtown while news anchors praised the charitable work of Carter. Dynamics. Grace was clearing a table when Lily walked over carrying a flyer. "Our food pantry was invited to the fair," she said excitedly. "They still need volunteers. We should go after our shift." Grace smiled. "If they need help, then we should be there." Neither woman noticed the color drain from Ethan's face as he quietly stirred his untouched coffee. He understood immediately what would happen if Grace attended. There would be no more time to explain. There would be no quiet conversation beneath the cafe lights. The truth would meet her all at once beneath cameras, reporters, and thousands of strangers. "You look worried," Grace said gently after Lily walked away. Ethan forced a faint smile. "Have you ever had the feeling that your entire life might change before sunset?" Grace laughed softly. "That sounds dramatic." He looked into her eyes, wishing he could freeze the moment forever. "Sometimes dramatic things happen without asking our permission." Grace tilted her head with curiosity, but before she could respond, another customer called her name. "Do not disappear," she said with a smile. "I will only be a minute." Ethan watched her walk away and quietly slipped a small envelope beneath his coffee cup. Inside was a handwritten note containing only one sentence. "I should have trusted you with the truth sooner." He almost left it there. His hand even reached for his jacket. But something stopped him. No, she deserved more than a note. She deserved to hear the truth from him. 40 minutes later, Harbor Street Cafe closed for the afternoon, and Grace joined Lily and several volunteers heading toward the Community Innovation Fair. Colorful tents filled the downtown plaza while families explored exhibits celebrating education, technology, and local charities. Children laughed as musicians played cheerful music beneath strings of white lights stretching across the square. Grace admired how many organizations had come together to help the city. "This is amazing," she whispered. Then the announcer's voice echoed across the plaza. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the founder and chief executive officer of Carter Dynamics, Mr. Ethan Carter." Grace turned toward the main stage with a polite smile that vanished almost instantly. The giant screen above the platform lit up with a familiar face. The worn jacket was gone. The faded jeans had disappeared. Standing confidently before thousands of people was the same man who had shared soup, walked through autumn streets, folded napkins crookedly, and accepted her last dollar with grateful eyes. For one impossible second, Grace simply stood frozen. Her heartbeat seemed louder than the applause surrounding her. Ethan stepped onto the stage wearing a tailored charcoal suit, yet his expression carried none of the confidence expected from one of the country's most successful business leaders. Instead, his eyes searched the enormous crowd until they found hers. Time seemed to stop. Every conversation around her faded into silence. Lily looked from the stage to Grace and back again with complete disbelief. "Grace," she whispered, "that is your friend." Grace could not answer. She remembered every conversation, every half-truth, every carefully avoided question, and every moment she had believed she knew exactly who Ethan was. Suddenly they all fit together in a way that stole the air from her lungs. On stage, Ethan accepted polite applause before walking toward the podium. His prepared speech rested untouched beside the microphone. He looked out across the crowd, but his attention never truly left the woman standing near the back beside the food pantry volunteers. In that moment, the billionaire who had addressed presidents, investors, and international audiences without fear discovered that only one pair of eyes could make him question every word he was about to say, because the only opinion that truly mattered belonged to the woman who now knew the truth, and the look of quiet heartbreak on Grace Bennett's face hurt more than every business failure he had ever survived. Grace could not remember leaving the crowd. One moment, she stood among volunteers listening to applause echo through the plaza, and the next, she was walking without direction along the quiet streets that bordered the Charles River. The cool autumn air filled her lungs, but it did nothing to calm the storm. Inside her mind, every memory replayed itself with painful clarity. The worn jacket, the paper cups of hot chocolate, the crooked napkins, the quiet walks beneath the streetlights. Every moment had been real, yet every moment had also been wrapped inside a secret she had never imagined. Behind her, the Community Innovation Fair continued with music and celebration, but Ethan heard none of it. The moment his speech ended, he thanked the audience, ignored the reporters waiting near the stage, and walked straight past the executives trying to stop him. "Mr. Carter, The press conference begins in 5 minutes. One assistant called after him. Ethan did not slow down. Cancel it. The national networks are waiting. They can wait longer. Olivia watched him leave with a quiet understanding. For the first time in years, the billionaire who never missed an obligation had chosen one person over an entire room full of cameras. Nearly 20 minutes later, Ethan finally spotted Grace standing near the river, watching the afternoon sunlight ripple across the water. She heard footsteps behind her, but did not turn around. "I know it is me," she said softly. Ethan stopped a few feet away. "Grace." She closed her eyes for a moment before facing him. The expensive suit looked strangely unfamiliar on the man she had come to know. "How long?" she asked quietly. "How long have you been pretending?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "From the first night we met." She nodded slowly, absorbing the truth she had already suspected. "So every conversation began with a lie." "Not every conversation," Ethan replied gently. "Only my name was hidden. Everything I felt was real." Grace looked at him with tears gathering in her eyes, though none of them fell. "Do you know what hurts the most?" Ethan remained silent. "It is not that you have money. It is not that you are successful. It is that every time I trusted you a little more, you already knew something about me that I did not know about you." Ethan lowered his eyes. "You are right." There was no excuse in his voice. No attempt to defend himself. Only regret. After a long silence, he reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and carefully removed a small cloth pouch. "There is something I need to show you." Grace watched as he opened it. Inside rested the folded $1 bill she had given him on that rainy evening, the tiny blue knitted heart her mother had made, and the faded paper receipt from the turkey sandwich she had shared with him. "I carried these every day," he said quietly. "Not because they were expensive, because they reminded me of the kind of person I wanted to become." Grace stared at the familiar objects in disbelief. The dollar bill remained carefully folded exactly as she remembered. "You kept all of this?" Ethan nodded. "Every day." He looked directly into her eyes. "I started this journey believing I had to test whether kindness still existed. Then I met someone who never asked who I was, what I owned, or what I could give her. Somewhere along the way, I stopped running an experiment. I simply fell in love with you." Grace listened without interrupting. The honesty in his voice was undeniable, but so was the pain created by his silence over the past weeks. "Do you know why I never cared about that luxury car we saw outside the cafe?" she asked. Ethan shook his head. "Because I believed the man beside me was already enough." Those words struck him harder than any criticism ever could. Grace took a slow breath before continuing. "I never needed a billionaire. I only wanted someone who trusted me enough to let me know the truth." Ethan closed the distance between them by a single careful step, leaving enough space to honor her feelings. "Then let me earn that trust back," he said softly. "Not with my company, not with my money, just as Ethan." Grace looked at the river, then back at the man standing before her. For the first time since discovering his identity, she did not see the famous executive from the giant screen. She saw the man who had laughed over badly folded napkins, shared quiet walks beneath falling leaves, and treasured a single dollar more carefully than priceless possessions. Her heart still ached, but beneath that hurt was another truth she could no longer ignore. The man who had deceived her was also the same man whose life had been quietly transformed by her kindness, and now the future of both their hearts depended not on what had been hidden, but on what he would choose to do next. 3 days passed before Grace called Ethan and asked if they could meet again. She chose the same small community garden where they had once stood together beneath the autumn sky, surrounded by lavender, herbs, and late-blooming flowers. Ethan arrived early, wearing simple jeans, a light sweater, and the same worn jacket he had first worn on that rainy evening. There were no security guards, no luxury car waiting nearby, and no reporters hiding behind cameras. He had left every symbol of his fortune behind because he wanted this conversation to belong only to the two of them. Grace walked through the garden gate carrying a small wooden box. She smiled politely, though her expression remained thoughtful. "Thank you for coming," she said. Ethan nodded. "I would have come anywhere." They walked slowly along the narrow stone path until they reached a quiet wooden bench. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Grace placed the wooden box between them. "Open it," she said. Ethan carefully lifted the lid. Inside rested another folded $1 bill. Beside it lay a simple handwritten note, and a small photograph of the neighborhood food pantry where Grace had volunteered for years. Ethan looked at her with quiet confusion. "What is this?" Grace smiled gently. "The dollar is not the same one I gave you. I know you still have that one. This one is for someone else." Ethan waited for her to continue. "Yesterday, I helped a young college student who had missed the last bus home. She was embarrassed because she did not have enough money for another ticket. I remembered that rainy night, so I gave her my last dollar." Ethan listened silently. Grace looked toward the flowers before speaking again. "Kindness does not belong to one person. It keeps moving from one heart to another." Ethan closed the box slowly, feeling the weight of her words far more than the objects inside. "Grace," he said quietly, "I know I cannot erase what I did." She nodded. "No, you cannot." He lowered his eyes. "But I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to question whether I am being honest again." Grace studied his face for a long moment. There was no fear hidden behind his smile anymore. No disguise. No carefully written story. Only the man who had finally chosen truth over comfort. She reached into her pocket and gently pulled out the tiny blue knitted heart her mother had made. "My mother asked me something after I told her everything," Grace said. Ethan looked up. "What did she ask?" Grace smiled. "She asked whether the man who sat with me in the cafe still existed." Ethan answered without hesitation. "He does." Then she told me something I will never forget. Grace's eyes softened. She said money can change where a person lives, but only character decides who comes home at night. Ethan felt his throat tighten. Grace stepped one pace closer and looked directly into his eyes. "When I met you, I believed you needed kindness more than money. Today I know you never needed another dollar. You needed someone who expected honesty instead of perfection." Ethan nodded slowly. "You were right." Grace took a deep breath before smiling for the first time since the truth had been revealed. "So here is my final choice." Ethan waited, almost afraid to breathe. If one day your company disappeared, your fortune vanished, and all you had left was that old jacket, those crooked napkins, and the courage to tell me the truth, I would still choose you. Ethan stood completely speechless. Every argument he had prepared disappeared. Every carefully planned apology suddenly felt too small. For a man who had negotiated billion-dollar contracts without hesitation, no words could answer the simple honesty standing in front of him. Grace reached for his hand. "But promise me one thing." "Anything," Ethan whispered. "Never test my heart again. Walk beside it instead." A smile filled Ethan's face as he gently nodded. "I promise." Months later, their wedding was held in the same community garden with family, close friends, cafe coworkers, and volunteers from the neighborhood food pantry filling the simple wooden chairs. There were no extravagant decorations, only fresh flowers, warm laughter, and people who loved them for who they truly were. Inside their first home together, framed on the living room wall, hung four ordinary treasures that no amount of money could ever replace. The original folded $1 bill from the rainy night they met, the faded sandwich receipt, the tiny blue knitted heart, and a photograph of two smiling people standing outside Harbor Street Cafe, reminding them every single day that true wealth had never been measured by what they owned, but by the kindness they chose to give when they believed no one was watching.